So hello and welcome everybody. My name is Dan Rodney and I'm going to be presenting an intro to SVG, Scalable Vector Graphics. For those of you who are not familiar with Noble Desktop, Noble Desktop is a computer training center in New York City. We teach people design and code, so we teach a lot of web design, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, as well as other design apps. So Photoshop, Sketch, Adobe Experience Design, After Effects, InDesign, Illustrator, a lot of the Adobe apps, and that's the kind of stuff that we teach here in New York City, and people can attend classes that we offer live in person, and they can also do them online as well. So if you can't make it to New York City, you can still enjoy our training. These free online seminars that we do live stream here on YouTube are one way, but any of our regularly scheduled classes, you can also, for the paid classes, you can attend those online as well. I'm going to be doing a presentation, and the link for the presentation is in the video description down below the video. For those of you who are attending live, I'm also pasting it into the chat. If you're watching the recording of this video, it will be in the video description down below. And that said, I'm going to actually start doing a screen share here so you can see this. So this is the presentation, and this is the link that is in your chat if you're watching live, and in the video description down below if you're watching the recording. And in here you can just use your arrow keys to navigate back and forth, or if you're on a touch device you can swipe back and forth. So some of today will be live demonstration, and some of it will be in this presentation, and we keep this presentation up so you don't have to worry about it going away, and it's got a lot of useful reference material as well as some demo files that I'm going to be using. And if you want to practice and play around with any of the files that I'm going to be demonstrating in the seminar, you can download those files here. For those of you who are watching live, don't feel like you have to follow along in your browser with this presentation. You could just watch the presentation, but the link is there for you to have as a reference later on. All right. So what are we going to be doing? So quick review of the agenda for today. First of all, what is SVG? Why should we use it? I want to show you some examples. How do you create the SVG? What apps do you use? Tips for things you should keep in mind for generating them. How to use it in a web page, and how to animate SVG, which is kind of a clue that you can animate SVG. All right, so what is SVG? It's Scalable Vector Graphics. Basically, when the web got started, we only had pixel-based graphics. Well, actually, when the web first got started, we didn't have graphics. But very soon after that, then we got graphics, but they were pixel-based graphics. Starting with HTML5, we had native support built into the browser for SVG, Scalable Vector Graphics. So it's a way for us to use vector graphics on the web. Prior to that, there were other ways to use vector graphics on the web, such as Flash. Flash was vector graphics, but it required a plugin. Flash has, of course, since then died off, and people aren't having that plugin anymore. Adobe's killing off that plugin at the end of 2020, and so it was a way to do vector graphics, but it wasn't built into the browser as native functionality. And if you remember many years ago, you might have heard of SVG before HTML5, back when Macromedia had Flash, and before Adobe bought them. Adobe was pushing SVG as kind of a competitor to Flash, but back then it was not native built into the browser. It wasn't part of the HTML specification, and so it also required a plugin. And whenever Adobe would install their apps, they would often install the SVG plugin, but unfortunately the plugin had never really got wide acceptance. A lot of people didn't get it, so it never really took off, and Flash is the one that took off at the time. But now we don't need plugins. It's built into the browser. So it's great to use in web pages, but unfortunately don't use it yet in emails. It's not going to work in a lot of places. So if you're using emails, still use your PNGs, GIFs, and JPEGs and your pixel-based graphics, but feel free to use SVGs in your web page. As its name implies, it is primarily for vectors, but a lot of people don't realize that it can actually contain other things. It can contain vectors, live text that's editable text, and also pixel-based images. And if you kind of think of it as PDF in a way, if you're familiar with the PDF format, in a PDF file you can have live text, you can have vector graphics, and you can have pixel-based graphics. That PDF format is kind of a container that can contain lots of different things. SVG is similar in that same sense, that it's a container format that can contain vectors, text, or pixel-based images. So it's not only limited to vectors, it can have additional stuff. It's a coded format. It's actually written in XML. Now, the ML part of that is markup language, and if you're familiar with HTML, that's also a markup language, and if you know HTML, XML looks very understandable. It's the same syntax. The actual tags are different, but it is still a tag-based language that you use to mark up stuff, and the general syntax is the same as HTML for the most part. It will look very, very understandable if you know HTML. That said, you don't have to code these things. You can generate these with graphics apps. But technically, behind the scenes, it is a coded file format. So why should we use it? It's vectors, so that means you can use it at any size. You don't need to have low-res and high-res versions of your pixel-based graphics if you can just save it as one single vector-based graphic. So your logo can be a single logo that you can use at any size and any resolution screen. So it's going to look great on low-res screens, high-res screens, at any size. Before, with pixel-based graphics, we'd typically save out multiple versions of icons or logos for different sizes and different resolution screens. Now a single file can be used at any size and for any resolution. So it looks great. It's also typically a smaller file size than a pixel-based graphic, so it's going to download faster. So that's good for the user. Really importantly, it can be animated with JavaScript or CSS, which a pixel-based graphic, you can't go in and start animating parts of that pixel-based graphic because it's one pixel-based graphic. But with JavaScript and CSS, you can go in and animate parts of your vector graphic. You can also style those vectors with CSS, and we're going to show you this today. We're going to show you how to animate things. We're going to show you how to style it with CSS. So that means that if you bring in an icon into your page and maybe on hover you want to change that color of that icon when you mouse over, so maybe the text changes but also the icon that you moused over also changes, you could just make a style for that and say, hey, when I roll over this, make it red. And so instead of having to create two different versions of a graphic with two different colors, you can make a single vector graphic and just simply say to change the fill color or the stroke color. So again, one graphic can be used in multiple instances with different colors, all from a single vector graphic. With pixel-based graphics, you'd have to make multiple versions of those at multiple sizes, at multiple resolutions. So it's just a lot more efficient when you're using SVG. So let's take a look at some examples. First, we'll take a look at static things, and then we'll look at some animated things. In here, we've got a logo over here, we've got some logos over here, and then we've got a graphic here. These are all SVG files. If I make this stuff bigger by Command plus zooming in on the Mac or Control plus zooming in on Windows, these things still look great at whatever size they are because they're vector. Now, they still also have pixel-based graphics on the page as well, but these are vector-based. And one of the ways you know is because you zoom in and it still looks good, but another way you can also tell is if you right-click or control-click on something in the browser and inspect it. You can see right here, this is an image that ends in .svg, so that is a scalable vector graphic. Okay. Let's take a look at another example here. Here they have lots of graphics, and these are just a few, but as you scroll, there's tons of them. And I mean, there are tons and tons and tons of these. Now, with each one of these, when you mouse over, the colors change. So it goes from white on blue to blue on white. And imagine having to create pixel-based versions of all these icons in two different colors. Whereas here it's just one vector graphic, and on mouse over, you can change the color just using code. So just one of the graphics. So if you ever update it, you just have to update it once, and the hover state is still done purely through code. So you cut down on the number of graphics you have to download. You cut them in half. So you'd have to download half as many graphics. And they're vector, so they're going to download faster because the file size is going to be smaller. So they look great on all resolution screens. They can be sized any size you want. They download faster. They're more flexible. What's kind of not to like? We have a question in the chat. Can you or would you use a sprite sheet of SVGs or keep them all separate? You can do whatever you want. You can keep things separate if you want to, just like you did with pixel-based graphics, but you can also make SVG sprites as well. So if you were using pixel-based sprites, you could do SVG sprites the same way. On top of all that coolness, we can animate SVG, which is great. All right, let's open up this example here. So here it draws in, and then there's some animation going on here. And then again, there was a little animation there. These state icons over here, those are also all SVG icons for the different states. Here there's another drawing part. Any of these things can be vector graphics. It's going to download faster, but also animatable so that they can be drawn. Here we've got some vector graphics over here. They've angled them in this case, but those are vectors there. Look nice and sharp. These are also vector graphics here, but also these are animated. So if you watch, every once in a while, a little something changes. Other icons here, animate a little bit more. So this is an SVG animated icon. And all of these little icons here have subtle little animations. If you're a typography person, this is a fun little site. But this is a scalable vector graphic. You can mouse over the different parts and click on one of them to see more. And again, here there's another SVG that happens to be animated. And you can go to the next one and see another SVG animation. So not only are they vector graphics, but then they're animated. Here their logo, of course, is a vector graphic. They've got some other vector graphics here. Got some interesting things going on in this page, some cool animations. But if I go back up here to the logo, check out the logo here as I scroll. Because this content would hit that logo, they kind of collapse the name into the icon. And actually doing an animation like that, we're going to see how to do an animation pretty similar to that actually today. That could be really just a couple lines of code using JavaScript. You can create a cool little animation like that. We'll take a look at how to create an animation pretty much like that today. And next up, of course, if you have a drawing, you can actually make it look like it's being drawn. So you can animate the creation of that. In this particular article, some things are just standard vector graphics that don't animate in, but every time that kind of gets to a new section where they want to draw your attention, they animate the drawing of that particular icon, that image. So here's just some static ones, and then some animated ones. And it's not to say that everything is going to be vector. Of course, there's pixel-based graphics. You're still going to use JPEGs for photography. SVG isn't replacing everything on the web, but it's good for vector graphics. All right, so those are just a couple examples of some things just to get you excited about learning this stuff. How do you go about creating these things? Well, any app that you use that creates vector graphics, if it has some sort of ability to save for the web, it should have an SVG option when you're saving that graphic. So if you're using Adobe Illustrator, Sketch, Adobe Experience Design, which is Adobe XD for short, Inkscape, which is a free program. Any of these vector graphics creation tools have an SVG export or saving option. I'll be showing you Illustrator, Sketch, and Adobe Experience Design. Those are the primary tools that a lot of designers are using to create their vectors. So I'll show you those today. I mentioned Inkscape just because if you don't have any of these apps and you want a free one, Inkscape seems to be the most popular free one if you want to go freebie. Notice I did not mention Photoshop. Photoshop is primarily a pixel-based program. Now, it can do vector-based stuff to some extent, but most of the time, Photoshop doesn't export SVG the way that you want. Photoshop is capable of exporting SVG in some specific instances. The biggest problem is that it only exports a proper SVG file from native Photoshop vectors. And that means something that was drawn with Photoshop's native vector tools, so it was drawn in Photoshop, or if you copied and pasted from Illustrator, you chose to paste as vectors, not a vector smart object. And what I find is that most of the time I'm not drawing native Photoshop vectors inside of Photoshop. Now, technically also type, if type was in there, that is a native vector. That could also be exported as SVG from Photoshop. What most typically I do, though, is I'm going to be bringing in things from Illustrator as a vector smart object. And unfortunately, even though that vector smart object does contain vector information, Photoshop can't access it. It will export that as an SVG, but if you look at the actual SVG file, there's no vectors in it. It's just embedding a PNG of that graphic inside of an SVG file, which is not at all what we want. So for the most part, if you've brought in something into Photoshop, if you placed it or if you paste it as a smart object, if it's a smart object, you're going to have to double click on it to go back over to Illustrator and use Illustrator to save it out. And that's why I'm going to be using Illustrator instead of Photoshop to do this. And of course, it is a vector. It is a coded format. You can code the native SVG code, which is XML based, and you can write them yourself if you want to. But I would think that most people are probably not going to be hand coding. Most people will be using a design app. All right, so now I want to show you this stuff. As a reference, I've included some links to some various things that we're going to be talking about today, and just a little bit of reference here for you. And I'm going to start with Adobe Illustrator, showing you those. And a lot of the tips that I'm going to be talking about, I've written up an article in depth on my website, on my blog, and this talks all about these different saving options, ways to save in Adobe Illustrator, the various export options and what they do, which ones you should typically use, and I've done a really in-depth address of that topic there, but I'm going to be explaining it in person here. But that's just for your reference for later on. All right, let's minimize that and go over here to Illustrator to see how to create an SVG. In essence, it's as simple as exporting a file, but it's not quite that simple because Illustrator has a bunch of saving options that really affect the quality of the code and how this is going to work. And if you are planning on animating this or styling it later on, the options that you have in Illustrator for saving an SVG file are really quite important for how you're going to control this later on. Now, anything that you create in Illustrator, if you were to create a new web document and start to draw stuff, doesn't really matter the size of that document. If you start to draw something as a vector, let's say I go and give that a fill color, there's a beautiful vector there. I could save that as an SVG file. Anything you draw in Illustrator. Now, I already have a file prepped that I want to use, so I'm going to go to my desktop here, and these are the demo files that you can download at the beginning of the presentation link that I gave you at the beginning of this live stream. And in here I have an arrow that I want to export. Simple little graphic, but I have a specific arrow that I want to export. If I look at that as actual size, this is how big it is. So that's how big the arrow will be in my browser. And I can go bigger or smaller than that if I want to. But if I export this at this size, I might want it to remember this size so that when I bring it into my web page, it remembers the size that I designed it. It's vector though, so I can always go up or down from this size with no loss of quality because it's vector, but I might want it to remember this initial size that I designed this at. I also have another file, which is a logo, the Noble Desktop logo. And in this case, the text is white. If I throw a rectangle behind this, you can see it. Let's do like black there. Object, arrange, send to back. So you can see the logo a little bit better. In this case, I showed the transparent background here under View, this transparency grid. If you show that transparency grid, you can see what is transparent in the document, because SVG files are capable of being fully transparent or partially transparent. When you do opacities, if you were to go and lower the opacity to do a partial opacity, SVG is fully capable of maintaining that transparency. So if you want to see what is transparent and what is white, you can show that transparency grid, and you can see actually how this will look. The white of the artboard is not actually going to show through in your final SVG. It will be transparent. The only thing that's white in an SVG is things that you've filled with a white fill. So these shapes I've actually filled with a white fill, and they will be white when I bring it into my web page. All right, we're going to start with this arrow right here. I'm going to go to File, Export As. Now, if you're using older versions of Illustrator, you won't have File, Export, Export As. But if you have a recent version of Illustrator, this is what you will have, and this is the better of the two saving options for either saving or exporting. There's also another way that I'll show you if you have the recent versions of Illustrator, but Export As is preferable. The Save As is an older way of saving SVG files. You can save as an SVG file, but that code is more bloated. It's not as tight and efficient and good as the new export. So they basically rewrote the export for SVG, and they kept the old one, but they included the new one, which is more efficient, better, and if you have the export as, that is the one that you want to be using. One of the biggest differences, in addition to the quality of the code that they increased, it's a better quality code through the export. The size of your document here doesn't matter when you're using File, Export As. It's going to crop and just give you the arrow, and it doesn't care how big your artboard is. So it's not going to include that empty space. This artboard could be giant, and it doesn't matter. The SVG file that you get through File Export will just be the size of your art. However, if you're using Save As, it will actually include this space in your image. So when you bring it into your web page, it's going to have all this space around your icon. If you are stuck with the Save As because you're using an older version of Illustrator, you will want to go in and tell your artboard to fit to the artwork bounds. And that's going to trim off all the excess stuff, so now you just have it the size of the thing that you're trying to export. That's important if you're doing the file Save As. But if you're not doing Save As, if you're doing the file export, you don't have to worry about that because it auto trims down to your artwork for you automatically. I'm going to put this onto my desktop. I'm saving this as an SVG file, and I'm going to click Export. And these are the options that are important. I'm going to come back over and explain some of these different things, but I'm going to start here with the different stylings. I want to export this in 3 different ways so I can show you the 3 different options. The first time I'm just going to go down the line here. I'll do this internal CSS. I'm going to do that. This time I'm not going to minify the code. Ultimately, you're probably going to want to minify the code because that's going to shrink it down, remove excess space to try to give you a smaller file size. And that's good when you're distributing SVG. However, if you want to read the SVG, you want to actually look at the code, you don't want to minify it because that makes it harder to read. And I want to show you actually what the saving options are doing in the code, so I'm going to choose not to minify it right now. I'm also going to turn off responsive for right now, and I'll come back and I'll explain what that does in just a moment. All right, so I'm going to export with internal CSS right now. So I'm going to say OK. I'm going to go to my desktop and make sure that I write internal CSS. I'm going to go back and export this for those 2 other ways. So this one I'm going to say that's 2. And this is going to be the inline style. So version 2 was inline style. And one more export here, export as SVG. And I remember that this was presentation attributes. It's the last one, presentation attributes. So in every other way, these are the same. But I want to take a look at these. And on the Mac, if you're on your desktop, you could just hit the space bar to preview the graphic. And you can see it. Don't worry about all the empty space here. That's just a thing that the Mac desktop does. It's actually just empty space that's not part of the graphic. This is the part of the graphic that you're actually going to have. If you're not on Mac and you can't just hit the space bar, if you're on Windows, you can use any browser. Just open up a page in your browser, and you can drag the SVG into your browser window, and you can see it there. So if I drag all of these in, they end up looking exactly the same. So behind the scenes, what's different? Well, there might be a little bit of difference in file size. Not much of a difference here, although internal CSS is bigger. The presentation attributes and the inline style are virtually the same. But yeah, that is actually, in this case, that's a substantially bigger file size, relatively speaking, for the internal CSS. So it does make a difference in file size. The biggest difference is in the coding behind the scenes. I'm going to take these and open up in my code editor and talk about the differences here. First, we'll do the CSS. What this does is it goes through and writes out the different objects that are in your document. And if we look at my Illustrator file, this is made of two pieces. That little head and the line. So this is considered like a polygon and a line. So in here, we have polygon and we have line. What Illustrator does is, if you're used to coding up web pages, CSS is the coding language we use to style things. It comes up with a generic class name that it just says class 1, class 2, and it says, hey, class 1 has a fill of white, class 2 has a fill of none, and both of them have the same stroke. It's a rounded stroke, thickness of the stroke there, and that's how it styles it. So if you wanted to change the style, like if you wanted to change the black stroke to something else, you could come and edit it there, and that goes and edits both of them. But it's using CSS to do that. Another way to do that is to write that same CSS, but instead of writing styles, to write the CSS inline. So we have a style attribute on each element, and this style says exactly what the fill color is, the stroke color, the thickness. So the internal CSS is somewhat more efficient in some ways if you want to make edits, in the sense that if you want to change the thickness of both through code, you could change it in one place with the style. Whereas the inline CSS, you'd have to change it twice. But as we saw, the internal CSS actually ends up being a bigger file size. And the other problem with the internal CSS is that these names are pretty useless. So it's not the best code written. It would be nice if they were kind of nicer names. But it depends on how you want to edit this, if you want to edit the code later on. Now, inline style and presentation attributes are going to look almost identical when you look at these two. The main difference, though, is that the inline style uses CSS, the style equals, to do that. And the presentation attributes use attributes, which are XML attributes. And so there's a specific attribute for fill, as opposed to the CSS version of it. So this is like in HTML, it's kind of like using HTML attributes instead of CSS. Here we're using the SVG markup presentation attributes. So what's the fundamental difference between these two approaches? Well, if you know anything about CSS and overriding styles, what if you want to change the color of this when you mouse over? You want to create a style on your web page that says on mouse over, on hover, change the color. Well, inline style is the most specific kind of styling you can do, and it's very difficult to override. It's not impossible, but it's very difficult. So the inline style is something you probably don't want to do because it's very hard to override with your own CSS later on. The internal CSS is a little bit easier to overrule because as long as you're equally specific as their rules, you can beat their rules. But the presentation attributes is actually what I would typically recommend for most people because presentation attributes are not CSS. CSS will overrule these. just because you're not competing with other CSS. So the CSS will overrule these, and it's you get a kind of a cleaner file that if you want to change something more directly, you can just go to that one element and change it. You get most of the time probably more efficient code doing the presentation attributes, but it's definitely easier to override with CSS. So if you plan on being able to change the look of these using CSS later, presentation attributes is probably the way to go. So that's what I would personally recommend, is using presentation attributes in most cases. I'm not going to say always, but in most cases, that's what I would typically recommend, is going with presentation attributes. All right, so going back here to exporting as. Let's export this to my desktop as just plain arrow. So I'm going to use the presentation attributes. Fonts. If you keep them as live SVG fonts, that means the text will be real text, should you have any text in your documents. It will be actually legible, readable in the actual code, but that means that your web page has to load any custom fonts. If your web page is not loading the custom fonts, your text will be in a different font in your web page. If you want to make sure that people always see your text looking exactly the way you want it to, and you don't want to have to worry about fonts, you can convert them to outlines. Just keep in mind that it's no longer text, so it's not going to be as good for search engines, and it would not be something that like users could select and screen readers couldn't read that. So there is some advantages for search engines and screen readers to read true SVG text. The downside of it is you need to make sure you're loading the font in your web page. Now, this is all assuming you have text in your document. If you don't have text, then this is meaningless. Object IDs. You want your layer names to be used to name your various elements. For the Noble Desktop logo, later we're going to animate this. And so what we did here is we named all of our layers, and we created groups based on what we think we want to animate. So here we have the N, we have the N's background, and we have Noble Desktop as a whole. We grouped that. In that group, we have two subgroups, one for the desktop and one for Noble, because we might want to animate desktop separately from Noble. Also inside of those, we've named each an individual letter. In the N, we have each color named. Now these, you only need to name things that you're going to address later on to animate. So if you're not going to specifically go in there and say, I want to animate this one, you wouldn't have to give that a name. But you do want to name things that you want to animate or control. If you want to style it later or animate it later, you want to give it a name. And so this structure of grouping that you do and the names will make it through into your final your final SVG code. Let's see it. Let's export as. I'm going to go to my desktop here as an SVG file. And if you don't want to actually have to export it, if you just want to take a look at the code before you export, you can set some settings here and then click Show Code, and that will open up the code so you can take a look at it. So in here, we see that there's a path with an ID of Noble N, and there's a path with a Noble B. There's the ID of Noble, Noble Desktop. So it has all those IDs. All the names that I gave, the layers and the groups, they all make it through into the SVG file. And we're going to see how we use those in a little bit. So we have a good question in the chat. Any recommendations for how to name, what to avoid? You want to use all lowercase, so use standard web naming conventions. Use lowercase, don't use spaces in your names, use a dash or an underscore instead of a space. They're going to be IDs, which mean they have to be unique, so always choose unique names that you've never used anywhere else within this particular SVG. Now, let's go back and export as, and there's just a couple more settings that we need to make sure that we talk about. So normally you're going to want to check minify because that's just going to remove all the white space and you'll get a slightly smaller file size. But this responsive option, this is an important thing that Adobe normally has checked on, and I wish that they wouldn't have that normally checked on by default. What that means is to eliminate the width and height in the SVG. So a responsive SVG is one that's going to scale up and down with no default size. it's just going to fill whatever you stick it in. So let's export this as a responsive SVG. And let's also export it as a non-responsive SVG. So I'm going to say not responsive. All right. I'm going to uncheck responsive this time. And that's typically what I recommend, is unchecking responsive. Now, if you're not familiar with responsive web design is creating a website that responds to all different size screens. So most people, I think, would say, oh, I like responsive websites. They adapt to any size screen, so why would I not want a responsive SVG file? In their terms, Adobe's terms, a responsive SVG file is one that has no size. In here, if I resize my browser window, you can see, and just remember that this is white over here. This is where the white desktop would be. This graphic scales to be the full width of my browser window, and there's no size. Now that's great. It's flexible. I can make it any size I want, but if I designed it at a specific size that I want to use it in my page, the SVG file itself has no memory of that size. So I have to remember to code that in when I bring it into my web page. Unchecking responsive will remember the size that you created it in Illustrator. So it has a default size. And this is actually how a pixel-based graphic initially works as well. Pixel-based graphics have a default size. Now this is vectors. So even though it starts at this size, you can override the default initial size and make it any size you want. You can make it bigger or smaller, but oftentimes I like for it to remember the size that I created at. I want it to come into my web page at that size. And then if I want to make it bigger or smaller, I can do that, because any graphic in a page you can make bigger or smaller. The only question is, should you? In a pixel-based graphic, if you make that bigger, it's going to be pixelated. So you shouldn't make a pixel-based graphic too much bigger than you created it. But with a vector-based graphic, you can make it as big as you want. I can hit Command plus, and I can zoom in many, many times. This is 500% its original size, and it still looks beautiful and crisp, even on a Retina display, because it's vector quality. So just because it has an initial size, there's no limitation because of that. You can still override that initial size, but it's nice to have an initial size. With no initial size, you always must code the width and height, or at least the width, into this every single time you use it, and that's just extra work most of the time when you bring it into a web page. The other reason that you want to have it remember its original size is because Internet Explorer, and sometimes even Microsoft Edge, the new version of Internet Explorer, sometimes has problems if you don't include that initial width and height. So you can eliminate browser bugs in Internet Explorer and Microsoft Edge if you uncheck responsive. So that's why I recommend unchecking responsive when you're saving. Okay, so uncheck responsive. It'll code in the width and height, because really this responsive option means leave off the width and height. If that's checked, it's not going to put the width and height. If you uncheck it, it will include the width and height, so it remembers the size you created at. There is another way that you can export from Illustrator. If you have the new versions of Illustrator, there's something called the Asset Export panel. And with that, you can drag specific elements in or entire elements, and you basically just take this and you can either drag it in or click the new button, and whatever you have selected will be added to the export panel. You can actually add multiple different things, and you give it a name here, such as Noble Logo, and then you can export that as a particular format. Now, the settings that are used are the same as your file export settings. You can actually see those if you look under the format settings in the menu over here. And you can double check to see what your settings are. These are the same settings that if you've done a file export, it'll be using those same preferences. So it remembers that I did presentation attributes, remembers that I want my layer names, I do want to minify, but I don't want to leave off the width and height. I want it to code the width and height. So that's the same options that I just used. That's good. Now when I click export, I can export all of those files that you have selected here. So if you have multiple ones, you just select them all and click export, and that will put it wherever you want. I can create a folder called output, and it throws them all into there. So that's another way if you want to bring maybe a bunch of things that are in a file, you want to get them all out into an SVG format. That can make quick work of a bunch of things in Illustrator. Illustrator is not the only way that you can export, and actually Illustrator's got the most control. The rest of the programs are actually much, much easier because you just don't have much control over it. It just kind of does what it does. Next, I'll show Sketch. Now, Sketch is a Mac-only design app that some people use for their web design. I'm not going to get into which particular app you should use. That's kind of personal preference. I'm just going to show the various ones that you might be using. I have a sketch file here with those same pieces of art in here. And in Sketch, you just select your elements that you want to make exportable. And then on the bottom right corner of the screen, you click Make Exportable and choose SVG. As far as the names of the files, your layer names over here on the left, these layer names will be the names of your files when you export. When you're ready, you can either click the Export Layers button down here at the bottom right corner of the screen, or you can click the Export button at the top right corner of the screen. In that case, that Export button up here at the top right, you don't need to select anything. It'll just export everything in your document. Here I've got my two things. I can click Export, and I can go and I'll create a new folder for Sketch output. No saving options. It just does what it does, and you get what you get. It does use your group layer names and your individual object layer names, just like Illustrator does. If I go to my desktop and take a look at the Sketch output, open this up in my code editor, it is using the properties, the presentation attributes, I should say. The presentation attributes, just like Illustrator, how I mentioned using the presentation attributes, that's how Sketch does all of its work. It does not do inline CSS or inline styling. It doesn't do either of those. It just does presentation attributes like I had recommended in Illustrator. Also, it does include the width and height. Right here is actually how you can see the width and height being coded into the document. In Illustrator, if you check responsive, it doesn't include the width and height. So if somebody gave you an SVG from Illustrator and you wanted to basically kind of almost go back and make it as though you unchecked responsive, you could fix the graphic. Let me open this up in my browser here. So here's that responsive graphic. If I want to make that non-responsive, coding in the width and height, I could just open that up in my code editor and look for the view box. The view box is, it's kind of a complex topic for today. I don't want to really get into it too much. I have a link in the presentation if you want to understand more about the viewport and the view box and really understand how that all works. But the only thing you really have to understand for what we're talking about today as kind of an introduction for this is that starting at 0, 0 on the left, it's going to go 338.3 pixels across, and it's 51 pixels tall. So this is the Noble Desktop logo. So think about it. It's a wide logo that's kind of short. So this is the width, and this is the height. And since Illustrator did not code in the width and height, I can code in the width and height myself. Let me zoom in so you can see this a little better. The width you just copy from there, and the height you just copy from here. And that's what that responsive option in Illustrator does. If you check responsive, it doesn't include that. If you uncheck responsive, it does include that. So you can always go back in and add it yourself, and if you do, you just made it so that it won't scale. It goes back down to be its native size that you created it at in Illustrator. Okay. All right. Final one I want to show is Adobe Experience Design, if you're using that. Adobe Experience Design is very much like Sketch, but Sketch is made by a third-party company. a non-Adobe company, I should say, not a third party, but a non-Adobe company. And Adobe Experience Design is kind of a similar type of design tool, but it's made by Adobe. I'm going to open up a design that I've created for Adobe Experience Design. Same exact thing that I have in Sketch. I can take my elements that I have here that I've given good layer names on the left. If I look in there, I can see I have all the same layer names like I had in Sketch. And I can just select those different elements. It will use their layer names for the names, and I just say File, Export. I'm going to create a new folder for XD output. And we're exporting SVG. I don't have any images, so that doesn't matter. Now the minify here, if you check minify, it's going to wipe away your layer names. So you don't want to do that. And if you don't see these options, by the way, make sure you just click that options button right there. So in this case, if you want to keep your names, which if you want to animate something or style it later on, you're going to want those names, don't check on minify here. Leave minify off so that you get those names. Okay. Right. And then I can export those, and we could take a look at how those look. Let's open that up. So Adobe Experience Design, again, does not have any options. It just does what it does, and it's always writing the embedded CSS. At least that's better than the inline CSS, which would be harder to override. But this is the only way that it exports. You don't have an option for a different type of SVG export. So I'm not quite as fond of the way that XD creates its SVG files. I like the way that Sketch and Illustrator do the presentation attributes, but it will be perfectly serviceable. You can manage with it. It just sometimes might be additional code that you don't need. And sometimes it might be less code, but it just depends on the graphic and how it was styled. So there's actually, in some programs, there's really not much to exporting, and in other ones, there is quite a bit. I put that note here about Adobe Experience Design that minify omits the layer names. It just leaves them off, so it doesn't code the ID. Just be careful of that, because normally you'd want to minify. I wish there was an option to minify to reduce the white space and shrink up the code, but leave the layer names. That would be nice. All right. Now, all of these programs don't necessarily write the most optimal SVG code. So once you get it out, you might want to further optimize your code. And there's a great little website here. It's free to use. It's called SVGO, as in SVG Optimizer. And then they call it SVGO MG because the MG is the missing GUI, or missing graphical user interface. There is a thing called SVGO, which is a command line tool to optimize your SVGs, but this is a graphical version of it, so you don't have to use a command line. You can use a visual tool to do it. And I'm going to use a demo file that I've come up with. I've got my arrow that I've exported from Sketch that's ready to be optimized. Now, if I look at this in my code editor, we can see that it says that it was generated with Sketch. Who cares about that? Doesn't matter. That's just a needless comment that doesn't need to be there. Also, this XML isn't really needed to be there. There's some stuff in here like this description created from Sketch doesn't need to be there. There's an empty defs tag. There's just stuff that doesn't really need to be there. We could probably make it smaller. You just drag it down, drag it onto this window. And then right away with just the default options, you can see how much it saved you. Visually, you can turn on and off the show original. So now I'm seeing the original. Now I'm seeing the final version. Hopefully they're the same. If, of course, you see something change, then you got to be careful. Maybe there's a setting that you need to fix here. But if you overly try to optimize something, sometimes it can wreck your code and it can end up having a visual impact on it. So right now my arrow looks exactly the same, but yet it's 55% smaller. I can actually look at the code also, and I can see the original code versus the final code. Look at how much smaller it is. So much smaller. They're eliminating stuff that I don't need, all those little comments and stuff that I don't need, and the XML that I don't need up there. And it's just giving me the code that I actually need, and that's good. Now, you do have to be careful a little bit here, though. For example, like cleaning IDs. maybe you want to get rid of those IDs. Maybe somebody didn't name things properly. You just want to strip them away. But I don't want to strip away the IDs in this case. I named these things head and yeah, like I named that head. That's what I wanted there. I wanted that to be there. So if you don't want to strip out your IDs, just be careful because there's a setting that you could strip it out. So if I don't strip those out, I'm not quite saving quite as much code because it's keeping a bunch of those. There are a whole bunch of settings that you can go through and really control exactly how this thing looks. That's why there's a visual interface for this. So let's say this is what I want to end up with. I just click the download button here, and there I've got a smaller version of this. So this is a great tool that you can use to optimize. Whether you're getting your stuff from Illustrator, Sketch, Adobe Experience Design, any of them, you can optimize your files and they could potentially get even smaller than your graphics program exports. All right, now using it in an actual web page. You can use it like any image. Just pull it in as a standard HTML image. You can also use it as CSS background images. Another thing that you can also do is you can actually copy and paste the SVG code directly into your HTML. I'm going to show you all of these in just a moment. If you're copying and pasting the SVG code directly into your HTML, you get some good benefits. And also there's one little downside too. The benefit is that you can style it with CSS if you embed it into your page. That's great. So you can easily go in and say, hey, I want to change the fill color or the stroke color, and you can style it with CSS like you style anything else on the page because it's actually in your page. Individual elements within the SVG can also be animated. Now, if you just want to move a whole SVG file, you could just use your standard image tag and just move the whole image tag. But if you want to animate things within the SVG, individual elements, individual vectors, you can do that by pasting your code directly into your HTML. The downside is that if you're going to embed a logo into your HTML, and that logo is going to be used on every single page, it's not being cached for reuse across pages. It has to download that logo again and again in each HTML page. So it's not the most efficient for caching and reuse. If that's a major issue, it's something you have to think about. For small little icons, it's probably not going to increase your page load time very much because a lot of these icons are quite small. So that may not be a concern because you want to animate it. There's pros and cons to both sides. One last thing, if you're using this in your web page, most likely it'll probably just work when you put it onto your server, but it's possible that once you put it into your web page and you upload your website to the server, it's possible that it might not work. And there's an htaccess file that you might have to configure. This is basically a text file that's on your web server in the root level of your web server. And you just have to put a couple lines of code into that htaccess file that tells the web server, hey, this is what an SVG file is, so that it understands it. Some of the web servers that are using old configuration files don't know what an SVG file is, and therefore they don't serve it up, and it's as though it pretends to just skip it. It's like, oh, I don't know what that is, so I'm not going to give it up, and I'm not going to include it in your web page. Once you put this into your htaccess file, it understands what an SVG file is, it understands it's an image, and it will send it out. The other thing it also does is it enables gzipping. And you want to make sure that you enable gzipping on your server for SVG files. And if you're a designer, you don't really care about this, but if you're a developer, you want to make sure that gzipping is enabled for any text file that supports it, like HTML, CSS, JavaScript. But since SVG is a text file, gzipping can save you file size. And I bring that up because you might look at some of the file sizes and say, hey, this is 815 bytes. So it's like 0.8K. That's not big. It's a pretty small thing. But let's say you get an icon that's 10K. Sometimes I've noticed that a PNG version of an icon might be just slightly smaller than the SVG version of it. And so initially when I saw that, I'm like, well, wait a minute. If my SVG file is bigger than the PNG, why don't I just go with the PNG? Well, because if your web server is set to zip up your files and make them even smaller, then even though you don't see it on your computer, once you upload this, it's going to end up being smaller when it's delivered to users. Gzipping on your server is all invisible to the user. They don't see it, but it basically zips up the files for delivery so that the website gets smaller for sending through the internet. Okay. If you're used to zipping up your own files before attaching them to an email, gzipping is the same kind of equivalent for a web server. You don't notice it happens, but everything on the website gets sped up because the file sizes are smaller because they've been zipped. They've been compressed before they get sent to you. All right. We're actually about halfway through right now, so I want to take a 5-minute stretch break, restroom break. If you need to go grab a drink, go ahead and do that. And when we get back, I want to show you how to put these into a web page and show you how they work. I'm going to put up a 5-minute timer here so we don't lose track of time, and we'll get started in 5 more minutes. right, ready to continue here. All right, before the break, we left off with talking about using SVG in a web page, so let's take a look at doing that. Now that we've created some SVG. Okay, just realized my music was going. Just stop the music. All right, we got a bunch of exported things here. We're just going to delete all that stuff. I don't need that. Okay, we're going to start with this little website starter folder. I'm going to open that up into my code editor. It doesn't matter what code editor you're using. I'm using Sublime Text here, but it's about the code, not the program that I'm writing in. Let's take a look at this page here. I'm going to preview this in a browser. I know it's a fantastically beautiful web page. Now, we kept it simple just to keep everything easy. I'm going to place the logo here. Got a little bit of text. I've got 2 links. I want to put the arrow icon here on the links, and I want to put the Noble Desktop logo up here. All right, so here is the place where we're going to put the logo. I'm going to delete it and use a standard image tag. There's a source attribute where you go in to your image folder. That's where my SVG files are located, and I choose that just like I would any JPEG or PNG. If this were a PNG, it would just be a different file extension. Right now it's an SVG, so it has a SVG file extension. I save the page, I go back, and I hit refresh, and now I have the logo there. Perfect. So it's not any harder than just using a regular image in your web page. It just happens to be a vector image. Of course, there's more to it than this, but just using a basic SVG, you can just throw it in there like any image. Now, the key for sizing in this case is this was saved from either Sketch, Adobe Experience Design, which both code in the width and height, or in Illustrator, I made sure I unchecked the responsive option because that remembered the width and height for this graphic. If I had left the responsive option checked in Illustrator, this thing would have blown up to be the size of the page. And let me show you that actually. If I go into my image and I delete the width and height here, if I delete that, that's as though you checked the responsive option in Illustrator. And it doesn't include a width and height. And therefore, this thing expands to be the width of whatever it's inside of. It's inside of a content wrapper, which is restricting the width to this size, but it just fills up whatever it's sitting inside of. So I'm going to undo and put this back. Oh, I see somebody in the chat talking about the older versions of Illustrator, like CS6. Older versions of Illustrator only have file save as, and their code is not nearly as nice as the new file export in the recent versions of Illustrator. I think it was Illustrator 2015, CC 2015, that added the new file export. The new file export is so much cleaner in the code that it generates compared to previous versions. So if you're still on Illustrator CS6, you're going to get much more bloated SVG code, and you're definitely going to want to take it into that SVG optimizer to try to clean it up. But that's one of the reasons why getting the Creative Cloud is worth it, because you're going to get cleaner SVG files out of the new versions of Illustrator. All right. Okay, so I put the width and height back into my SVG here, so that way it remembers the size that I created it at. Let's insert another image in my page here. I want to put in an arrow right here, so I'm going to use another image tag, go into my image folder, and choose my arrow. And I'm going to copy and paste that after both of these links. Just going to save that and hit refresh in my browser. And there I get those arrows coming in, again, at the size that I created them, because in Illustrator, I unchecked responsive. And that coded in the width and height into my file. In my arrow, I've got a width and height, and that is what remembers how big to make it. So it comes in at the size that I created as. Now I realize once I get into my page, it's a little too big. I want to make it smaller. I also want to add a little bit of margin on the left, and so I need to customize this. Now, if all I want to do is change the size, put a little margin on it, I'd be fine leaving it as an image tag right here. But I don't like that it's black color and my link is blue. I also want to add a hover to the link so that the link color changes. I want the arrow to adapt to whatever color I'm currently working with. And because I want to use CSS to style this arrow, I can't leave it here as a linked SVG. Instead, I need to delete those images and I need to actually put the SVG code directly here into this page. So I'm going to go to the arrow SVG and copy that code. And I'm going to paste it directly here into my page. Now this is where it's not quite as efficient because instead of downloading the SVG once and using it twice, it's actually downloading that SVG essentially 2 times. Now this is tiny. It's not going to increase the size of my page very much, but technically it's not quite as efficient as a linked graphic. Now, if I refresh my page, we see it looks exactly the same, even with that embedded SVG. But because I embedded the SVG, I gained the ability to go in and style the things as though they're right here in the page. All right. Now, when I look at this, I see that this path has a stroke color. It has no fill because it's just a stroke. It's a black stroke. If you have a filled circle, then you might not have a stroke. You might have a fill. It just depends on what graphic you're dealing with. I want to go in and change the stroke color of this SVG. I have a CSS file already made. And both of those links, if I go back here, both of those links, I gave it a class of button so that I could talk to those buttons. The second button, I also gave it a class of secondary button so that I could style that one separately. But if I use the button class, I'm going to style both links. If I use secondary button, I'll only style the second link. In those links, I have the SVG file. If I look in my CSS, I've commented out some code so that it doesn't work right now. But if I uncomment out that code, if you're using Sublime Text, you can just go click into a particular line of code and uncomment that by using toggle comment. If you're not using Sublime Text, you can just delete the comment here to uncomment that code. I want to go into the button and talk to the SVG and do something. For example, change the height of it and put some margin on the left. You can use whatever measurements you want. If you want to use pixels or rems, that's up to you. In this case, I'm using ems because that's relative to my type size. So if I change my type size, the SVG will be scaled according to the type size change. But if you want to use pixels, you can also use pixels as well. Doesn't matter. So I save that and I hit refresh, and that put a little bit of space between these and made it smaller. So you can do that using CSS. Now, for the cool part, I want to go in and change the color of the stroke. So I'm going to uncomment this. In that button, I have my SVG. In the SVG, there's a path. Let's go to our HTML for a second. So in my SVG tag, there's a path. That path tag is the one that has the stroke. So the path has the stroke. Path is inside the SVG. In my CSS, I say, in my button, in the SVG, there's a path. Tell the stroke to be something. You could say, make it red if I wanted to. And then I have red paths. In this case, though, I wanted to invoke a cool CSS feature that has nothing really to do with SVG. It can be used elsewhere, too. But current color means the current text color. So I don't have to say that I want it to be this blue color that I'm using up here. I could just say whatever the current color is. That's just a cool CSS feature. And then it takes on the same color as my link. The really nice thing about that is that when I do a hover style, so when I have that button and I hover over it, I can change the color. And by changing the text color, the stroke will always be the current color. So when I mouse over, the icon changes as well. So right now I have a blue arrow, and when I mouse over, I get a red arrow. It's as though I have 2 graphics, but I only had to make one, and it just updates. That's the power. See, in that sense, it's more efficient. So even though they do have to download that arrow twice, I didn't have to make 2 versions of it. I didn't have to make a blue and a red one. And to go a little bit further, the secondary button, maybe you want to make that look different. I want to change the font size. I want to make it black. Well, guess what happens? Now I have a blue arrow, a black arrow, and still when I mouse over, it goes to the same hover color. So now I have 2 different sizes, 3 different colors. And if I change the color of the hover on the secondary button, maybe I didn't want that to be red. Now I've got the arrow in blue, in red, in black, and gray, in 2 different sizes. All of this from one original file that I made. You get so much flexibility in that sense. So that's the cool part about SVG, is that you can style it using CSS. And you don't have to make all these different versions and manage these different versions. You just style it using CSS. Let's see. Yep. Okay. So next, you might think about using vector icons by using icon fonts. And maybe you've been using icon fonts in your website. What I would recommend is typically don't deploy a website using icon fonts. Switch your icon fonts over to SVG for several reasons. First of all, a lot of times when people use icon fonts, what they actually deliver on the website is all of the icons because they download the entire font, but most people only use a couple of those icons. So you're kind of wasting some download time on a bunch of icons that you probably didn't use in your website because you're downloading the whole font. But the bigger reason is icon fonts, it's just text, and text gets one color. But SVG, you can do whatever you want. You can do gradients, you can do multiple colors, because an SVG icon can be anything that you want. So an SVG icon is way more powerful than a single character in an icon font. You can't animate parts of an individual character. So if you use an icon that's one character in an icon font, if you want to animate pieces within that icon, you can't, because you could just move the whole character around. You can't talk to part of a certain character in an icon font. SVG, you can animate it as much as you want. The other thing is if the icon font doesn't load, you get some weird things. Like you might have to use a weird character. So they're just not as semantic, and they're not as good for screen readers. Google has some cautions about using icon fonts. So for the most part, I would recommend using an SVG icon instead of an icon font. If you like an icon font and you want to use the icons in it, bring it into your design app, convert it to outlines, and then save that icon as SVG. So feel free to design with icon fonts. I'm just talking about deploying the website. The final website should be using SVG files typically instead of icon fonts. So now for the really fun part, which is animating SVG. You can do CSS animations for really simple stuff, but when you want more control, you can use JavaScript to do tons of really cool stuff. In particular, my favorite way to animate using JavaScript is something called the GreenSock Animation Platform, or GSAP. And using GSAP, you can animate anything within a web page, including SVG. So you could write plain old JavaScript, but if you want to create a JavaScript animation that performs well and works well across browsers, you're probably going to write a lot of code to get that to work well. And GSAP is a framework, it's a library that you can use that makes your animations so much easier to code. With just a few lines of JavaScript code, of specifically GreenSock code, you can animate things really easily compared to plain JavaScript that you'd be writing yourself. And you might think, oh, I'm just doing a simple little animation. I don't need some sort of library. I remember one time I thought the same thing. I started trying to do it with plain JavaScript, and I was like, oh, man, this supposedly simple thing got in more complex with timing, and I just gave up and just went to GSAP because it was just so much easier to do. So that's what I'm going to show you today, is a little bit of stuff with GreenSock. We're going to inline the SVG code like we did for styling it with CSS, because by inlining the SVG, putting it directly into the HTML, we're going to have access to animate the individual pieces using JavaScript or CSS. All right, so let me show you some CSS and JavaScript animations. We'll start with CSS. Technically, this won't be an official CSS animation. We're going to do a CSS transition. It will be a thing that animates. It will be a thing that moved, but technically there's two different things. There's CSS animations and CSS transitions. We're just going to show CSS transitions, but once you get the idea, you know, if you know CSS animations, you'll be able to use those on SVG just like you do anything else. We'll start with the CSS transition starter file here. Let's open this up in my code editor. Let's preview this. It's the same page that we just started with, not that long ago. And right now there's just no animation. I'd like it that when I mouse over one of these links, or well, both of the links, I want the arrow to move a little bit. So let's go back and see how to do that. Now, actually, in this particular case, if you just want to move that arrow, you wouldn't have to embed the SVG code into the page. We embedded the code into this page because we wanted to style it with CSS. But if you weren't styling the fill or the stroke with CSS, if you just wanted to put, like, you know, the original black arrow that we had, if you just want to throw that in there and just move it, you could just use a regular image tag for that. But since we have this page already done, we're going to animate the thing that we already have. We're going to go into our CSS. When we hover over a button, inside that button is an SVG tag. Let's go back to our HTML. In the button, we have an SVG tag. If you were leaving that as an image, then this would be image instead. I want to change the margin left. I want to increase the margin that's on the left. So normally there's 0.1 em. We're going to make it 0.4. We're going to increase the amount of margin, which is going to move it further away from the text on hover. So we're going to save that, come back, hit refresh. And now when I mouse over, now there's no animation, but there's movement. It does bump, 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 bump. There's no animation from the start to the end. It just jumps from start to end. I'd like it to animate between the start and the end. So for that, we can use it, CSS transition. The element at its start, not the hover part, but the same element, right? We're still talking about the SVG element. You say, hey, whenever you have that element, and you might transition to some other state, maybe a hover state or a focus state or some other state, transition to that other state. Animate any element that changes. So all the elements, all the properties, whether it's margin left or opacity, whatever it is. I'm not going to spell it out. I'm just going to say transition all the properties and take 0.15 seconds to do it. So that's going to happen pretty quickly. I'm going to save that, hit refresh, and now we get an animation. I'm going to zoom in on this so you can see a little bit better. So now, boom, 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 does a nice little slide. If I make that take longer, like 0.5 seconds, you can really see the animation taking a long time. You don't want to do that in real life. You don't probably want it to take that long, but there you can really see that little slide like there. Okay, so if you want to do simple little things like that, CSS is good for simple little things. If you want more complex things, then GreenSock or GSAP is definitely the way to go to do more complex things. Let's take a look at that. I have a couple demos that I can do for GreenSock. Let's look at a starter one here. Now, we actually just recently did a live stream on HTML5 animation with GreenSock. So if you want to learn more about GreenSock, definitely check out our video that we just posted not long ago. It was just this week. It was last Friday that we did that live stream. And there I go much more in depth in the basics of GreenSock. Here we're going to kind of fast forward and just give you some of the things, but you can definitely learn more about GreenSock in that other video. Let's take a look at this page and see what's going on here. I want to animate the Noble Desktop logo. Now, while we're at this, as kind of a side note, I also want to do a couple things in here that are going to be a little different than what we did before as far as styling goes. I want this to be bigger so you can really see the animation. This SVG I've embedded into the page because I need native access to all of these elements. So I put it here, paste it into the page so that I can talk to any of these IDs in the page. The whole SVG I've called logo, and here I have a CSS style that targets that ID of logo. I want to change its width. I know initially it's 338 pixels wide. I want to make it 900 pixels wide. So I save my page, I come back and I hit refresh, and it's still the 338 pixels in size. My size didn't work. I want to make this flexible, but this width is conflicting with it. I mentioned earlier that most of the time you want that width and height to be there because it does fix Internet Explorer issues sometimes. It doesn't always have issues. In this particular case, if I delete the width and height, Internet Explorer and Microsoft Edge are fine. They don't have issues. And by deleting those, it will allow my width up here to work because I do want to have a flexible width. I do want to have a changed width. Scale it up. That allows my SVG to change size. Now that I have something bigger that's easier for you guys to see, now we can go ahead and start to animate. Now, if you check out the GreenSock website, greensock.com, on there, they have a way that you can download it. You just click download, and they give you this link that you can copy and paste into your page. This loads the GSAP library from a content delivery network. Nice fast delivery network that you should be able to use. If you don't want to load it off the CDN, you can download a zip and link to the local versions if you prefer. I'm just going to link to that. In my page, at the bottom of the page, below all the elements, right before the end of the body tag is where we're going to put our JavaScript. We're putting all of our JavaScript at the bottom of the page to make sure that all the elements have already been loaded before the JavaScript actually executes. This script tag right here is what I copied and pasted from the GreenSock website. That loads in the GSAP library that I can now use. By itself, it doesn't do anything. We have to write JavaScript to utilize GSAP. In this script tag right here, I've put in a lot of commented out code, so none of this is working right now. We've got some commentary in here, and what I'm going to do just to be able to code through all of this without having to write it all out from scratch, I'm going to uncomment the lines so that they start to work. I'm just hitting the keyboard shortcut for toggle comment here in Sublime Text, which is Command/ on the Mac or Control/ on Windows. All right, so let's start with the main syntax here. We've loaded tween max. Now, tween max has two main things. They have a timeline max and a tween max. Tween max is how you tween things, and the timeline max is how you put things into a timeline so you can set sequences. If you're not doing a lot of sequences, you can just use plain tween max. But if you're doing a bunch of sequences like we're going to do, we're going to use the timeline max. But the basic idea, whether this is a tween max or a timeline, the basic syntax here is you're going to say, hey, let's come from a certain appearance, or let's animate to a certain appearance. And with GreenSock, you want to say, what do you want to animate? The target, like the word noble, the word desktop, the N, the background for the N, whatever it is in the page. The target that you want to animate, the duration of the animation. So how long do you want to take to animate it? Do you want to take a half second, a second, a tenth of a second? And then what are all the variables, the options that you want to animate over that time? All right. So the first thing we're going to do, because we have a bunch of things, is instead of using tween max, which doesn't have this kind of chaining concept, we're going to use the timeline. So this is a virtual timeline that GSAP creates so that as we add things to the timeline, the first thing you add to the timeline happens first, the second thing you add to the timeline happens second, and the third thing you add to the timeline happens third. That's great because we can chain one animation after another after another. But we first have to create a variable called whatever you want. I called it timeline, and this creates a new timeline within GSAP. Now that we have the timeline to put things into, now I can say, hey, that timeline that I created, that timeline, I want to tell it to take something, specifically the Noble desktop, the thing with an ID of Noble desktop. What is that? Let's go up here to my code. I named Noble desktop. I created a group. That's the G is for group. And in there is the Noble and desktop. That's the words. So that's the words Noble desktop. I created a group called Noble desktop. I gave it that name in my graphics app. I want to take those words Noble desktop. So hashtag Noble desktop means something with an ID of Noble desktop. Take that Noble desktop and animate from an opacity of 0. So normally in the page right now, if I look at the page, it's a normal opacity. I want to come from 0% opacity, so it fades in, so it appears. And also move horizontally as well. So X is horizontal, Y is vertical. All right, now and take 0.4 seconds to do that animation. I'm going to save that, come in and hit refresh. So now it fades in and slides in at the same time. So a little bit of fade and a little bit of a slide. Now after that, I want to animate the background for the N. That's this black background. I'm going to say, hey, the N background, because that's the ID that I gave that background. If I scroll back up here, here we've got that N background. We also have the N, which has all the colors inside of it, but the N background is the name that I gave it in Illustrator or Sketch or Adobe Experience Design. Take that N background and take 0.2 seconds, so just take a very short amount of time, fade it in from 0 opacity, and instead of doing a -40, which comes from the left and moves right, do a positive, which is going to move from right to left. Save that, hit refresh, boom, boom. First the Noble Desktop happens, then the N background happens because of this timeline concept. As you add things into the timeline, the second thing comes in after the first thing. If I reorder these things, if I put the N background first, I just hit a keystroke to swap my lines, then the background would come in first, and then the Noble Desktop. That's the cool thing about GSAP is that you can just do code order for how things chain into a timeline. Finally, I'd like to take the N, which is the N with all the colors. Take 0.2 seconds, fade in from 0 opacity, and again, move in the same direction that the background moved in from. Boom, boom, boom. Boom, boom, boom. One after the other. Pretty cool. It's amazing that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines of code could create that kind of animation. And because it's an SVG file, even though it's one file, I can animate the pieces because that SVG code is directly in my HTML. Now let's go even further. I'm going to comment out these lines and switch to a different animation that's a little cooler. And this one we're going to do, instead of from, we're going to do stagger from. Now the stagger from syntax is exactly like the from, except it has an additional parameter. You've got target, so what are we going to animate? Duration, how long are you going to take to animate it? All your options are variables of what you want to do, but the fourth thing is new, the stagger amount. So stagger means to take a bunch of things and animate them in one at a time, slightly offset. So the first thing happens, and then the second, and then the third, and then the fourth. So it's a staggered animation. This is going to take the Noble Desktop, and then the asterisk in CSS means anything. So space means something inside, so it's a nesting. In this case, anything that's inside. I don't care what it is, but something inside of Noble Desktop. And if you look at what's inside of Noble Desktop, remember that you have Noble and Desktop, but it's anything. So if you go inside of those, there's all these paths, which are the different letters. N-O-B-L-E. And in Desktop, of course, D, E, and so on. So there's all these paths inside of Noble Desktop. I want to say, for each one of those things inside of Noble Desktop, create a staggered animation. So stagger from 0% opacity, 0% scale. Take 0.4 seconds to animate, but this last thing is the new thing. That's the stagger amount. First letter comes in, and then 0.03 seconds later, the second letter comes in, and then 0.03 seconds after that, the next letter comes in, and it keeps going through until it's animated every single letter in, one after the other. So with basically 3 lines of code, we've just created this animation. That is pretty powerful because it's staggering the same exact animation, but 1, 2, 3, 4, it keeps doing the same one over and over again with the stagger amount. If I come back and I make the stagger amount 1 second, now you can see it does the first thing, a second later it does the next one, then the next, and then the next, and each one is 1 second after the previous thing. So you can really see it happening. If you make this stagger amount less than the length of your animation, then there's going to be an overlap, so you're seeing multiple things come in at the same time. That's how you get that cool effect. Pretty neat. Now let's comment that out and get even more interesting. Now for the next part, I'm going to do essentially the same exact thing, targeting those same elements inside of Noble Desktop with the same stagger from, same exact thing, except this time I'm adding an easing to it. Let's talk about easing for a moment. Easing is really how you give a lot of extra flair and kind of natural, interesting motion to your animations. The idea of easing is that in real life, most things don't start and stop with a linear motion. Most things, when you start to make them go, they take a little while to accelerate up to speed, and then when they come to stop, they don't just go boom and instantly stop. They take a little while to slow down at the end. So that start and end that goes slow is called an ease. Like go easy at the end, like slow down, go easy. So if you do a power 1 with GreenSock, it just goes a little bit slower at the start and a little slower at the end. Oh, that's assuming you're doing ease in and out. So an ease in would be at the start of the animation, and the ease out would be at the end of the animation. So going in or out at the start or the end. Do you just want to ease into the animation? So that goes a little slower at the beginning, but then it's going to end abruptly. If you ease out, it's going to start quick, but then end slow. The power 2 and the power 3 and the power 4 just accentuate this speed difference. So if you ease in, it goes really slow at the beginning and then goes fast towards the end. Really slow at the beginning, and then fast at the end. If you ease on the out at the end, it's going to start out really quick and then go really slow at the very end. Now you could do all sorts of interesting eases. You can also do a back ease where it goes a little too far and then comes back to where you really want it to be, like overshoots the mark. Go a little too far and then come back. And that you can actually configure, and you could do a bigger amount. So if you want to go even further away, that makes it go further away and it accentuates that different. You can do elastic, so it looks like it's an elastic bouncing thing. Boing, boing. You could do a bounce. Doing, doing. You got to add your own sound effects here. That's up to you. But yeah, you could do rough ones. So going from one place to the next does not have to be a smooth endeavor, and the rate of speed does not have to be consistent. So giving it a back ease where it overshoots and then comes back can be quite interesting. And we just take this ease code that we create here, copy and paste it back in, and put that as an additional parameter here in my variables. So I just added that in right from the GSAP website. So we're doing a back ease at the out, which is the end of the animation. So at the end, it's going to go a little too far and then come back to where we want it to be. Let's check this out. Boing. See that little kind of bloop? Let's slow that down a bit. Let's take a second to do that animation. So it goes too far and then comes back and kind of sits back. Gets too big and then comes back to the size we want. Gets too big. Oh, now if you look at the right-hand side here, look at the P. Because the P is getting too big, it's going beyond its point and coming back, the SVG file is cropping off some of the graphics. Now, earlier I had a link to talk about the viewport and the view box, and that's what's kind of useful here to understand is that viewport and view box thing. Because basically, you have an area that you're looking through to see your SVG file. And if that area that you're looking through is too small, the SVG can get cropped off. And that's what's happening here. I'm animating the SVG within the current view box. And if that's too small, well, then things can get chopped off. We could go back and edit the SVG code and add more space inside of it. But actually, a quick, easy fix is just to add padding inside of our SVG, and that will create some extra space. I experimented and figured out that 50 pixels was enough based on the animation that we wanted to create, but that put some extra space inside the SVG for the animation to kind of get bigger and then scale back down. So now, if I look on the right-hand side, now that I've added some extra space inside the SVG container, that does not get cropped off as it overshoots its bounds. It's still within the area of the SVG container. All right. Then we can do the background and so then we can do the background. Again, I added the ease back just to accentuate it. In this case, we did a scale instead. So we were doing an opacity and a scale. And the final, je ne sais quoi, this final effect, the cool finale, is to say anything in the N, which is the colored N that has all those colors in, anything inside of there, come from 0% opacity, come from a scale, do that cool little ease back. But now all those colors are going to animate in individually. Pretty cool effect there that we're creating. And if I go back, this is, of course, I had slowed this down. Let's put this back to something a little bit faster. Pretty cool little thing that we can create with just a few lines of JavaScript code. So I know that was a quick, fast introduction to GSAP. If you want to learn more about GSAP, definitely check out the HTML5 Animation with GreenSock live stream that we did last week. Now, before I get back to the presentation here, I do have one more thing that I want to show with GSAP. And this was inspired by a Spotify ad that I saw that used some SVG graphics and some other just normal text. This was a recording that I did of the Spotify ad because, of course, if you go back to a website, the ads are always changing. So I did a screen recording of the video, a screen recording video of the ad. So let's put this on loop. Turn that on loop just so we can see this ad play back and forth. Notice that cool little moving like zigzag gradient in the background. Just slowly move in the background just to kind of subtly give you a sense of movement. So not only do the things kind of come in order, like the Spotify logo comes in, then the text comes in, then the text comes in, then the button comes in. But while that's happening, this graphic in the background is slowly moving just to help kind of catch your eye. So I downloaded the assets from that and figured, hey, let's recreate this actual ad that I saw that was a Spotify ad because I thought, hey, this is a cool ad. Let's learn how to create something like this. Here's a starter file, starter folder. And let's take a look. If I open up these SVG files, just so we can see them, I'm going to just open them up in Illustrator. All right. Oh yeah, we don't need the Spotify logo. That's just the white logo. But this is the interesting part. This is the thing that was moving in the background. So as for the ad, they put a gradient on the background of the ad. And then they were just moving this along behind. And so they made this much taller than the ad. You know, the ad was maybe like this size right here. And then they were just animating this within the ad, moving that within the space. So let's see how to do this. I'm going to open this up in my code editor. And let's take a look at what we've already done. I've already created all the different elements here, put them into the page. There's a gradient for the background. This SVG is positioned off screen, and I want to animate all those pieces in. All right, so let's take a look here. So the ad, which I have down here. So here's the ad. In there, I have the content, which has all the text and the button. I have the logo, which is positioned on the bottom right. And then I have the burst, which is that cool gradient zigzag that they have. They called it a burst, so I kept that same thing. So that ad is a specific size. I gave it a width and height. I gave it a background color. I couldn't get their exact font, so I couldn't match it exactly, but this is kind of close to that. And then, styled the heading, styled the paragraph, styled the link. The logo I positioned at the bottom right of the page, and the burst I positioned in the specific spot so that a lot of it is hanging off screen. So I pushed it quite a bit down from the top because I pushed it 70 pixels down from the top. The ad is only 250 pixels tall, so pushing that 70 pixels down, that starts at 70 pixels down from the top. But that thing is really big, so a lot of it's hanging off screen here. So I really just need to move it up, not straight up, but up and to the right in here. All right. Oh yeah, so let's go back to my code editor here. I've already loaded in GSAP. I'm going to create a timeline like we did before. I'm going to say, hey, let's create a timeline using timeline max. And each thing individually, we're going to say, hey, the logo, which is an SVG file, I gave it a class of logo. Take a second to fade it in. So let's save that and hit refresh, and then watch this little logo right there. So that fades in. I'm just doing it exactly like they did. Secondly, the logo took a second to come in, fading in from 0% opacity. So the logo and then the heading, just one after the other. Then the paragraph, that not only faded in, but it also moved vertically. So I moved it 20 pixels vertically. That's Y. X is horizontally. Fade in, fade in. Then, so that slides in like that. And then the link fades in as well. The logo and the burst were the only SVG parts, but this is kind of the interesting part here with the burst. That took 15 seconds. That was just a slow movement for quite a long time going on in the background. Vertically, I'm moving it up. That's why it's going negative. Positive would move it down. Negative moves it up. And then X also moves it to the from left to right a little bit. So that gives it the diagonal. Instead of just only moving up, we're moving up and to the right at the same time. Now I wanted that to start while these other things were animating so that there was a little bit of overlap, which is what they did. So within GSAP, there's a position parameter that you can use. It's a fourth optional parameter. Here you've got these three things and then the fourth optional one. And in quotes, you put either plus equals or minus equals. Plus equals would add time. Minus equals would remove time. So this says, if I don't have any position parameter, this would happen exactly after all of those things are finished. So whenever this is done, then this would happen. But I wanted to say, no, start this 3 seconds earlier. So pretty much after the logo would happen, then I want this to start. So these things all go in sequence. And normally, whenever this would start, it's going to start 3 seconds earlier because the 3 is for 3 seconds. So I save that, come back and hit refresh. And now you notice that this thing starts to move very slowly because it takes 15 seconds to animate. And it's moving in the background, slowly animating. Now, most of the time, ads you want to repeat. So the cool thing about GSAP is that you can add a repeat inside of your timeline max. And in this case, we'll repeat it twice. So it'll play once and then repeat 2 more times. Normally, they don't allow ads to repeat infinitely. So you normally have to put a limit. They typically say you can play them once, twice, or 3 times. And so once it's done with it first, it'll repeat and play it again, and then it'll repeat again. So this was just an interesting thing that, technically speaking, could have been done with pixel-based graphics, but because it's SVG, it's clean, it's fast to download. If you were going to do a big PNG of this, because you'd have to do PNG for the transparency, that would have been a much bigger file size compared to this SVG file. But this is a real-life example of how people are using SVG in the wild. This is an exact recreation of a Spotify ad that I just happened to see on the internet as I was going around and thought, hey, this would be a cool thing to show you guys how to create something like this. So I'm going to open the chat up for questions. We do have additional ways that you can learn more stuff. Like certainly if you want to learn more about GSAP, we have a great class and book for that. It does expect that you know HTML and CSS to create your layouts and to at least know some JavaScript, because GreenSock is JavaScript. So the more JavaScript you know, the better off you are. But you at least should know some fundamental JavaScript before going into our GreenSock class. If you want to learn more about CSS animations in general, we have a cool responsive CSS3 scrolling effects seminar or workbook. And just in general, if you're not that great with code and maybe you didn't understand some of the code stuff that we were going into today, we have a bunch of web development classes and workbooks that you can check out. I'm going to turn on my video here and check out some of the questions in the chat. One of the questions I see are there effects in Illustrator that are not supported in SVG? There are, off the top of my head, I don't have a good list of the various different effects that might not work properly. But one thing, I'm not sure, off the top of my head, I'm not sure if blending modes work properly. You'd have to try those out and see. But basically, you're going to see it. If you try to do something and you export it, when you open up in a browser, if it doesn't look right, then you know that that's not supported properly in SVG. So you might see certain things get messed up in translation. And then you'll know not to use those particular effects. So if you ever have a question, hey, is this going to work in SVG? Just use it, export the SVG, open that up in your browser, and try it out and see if it worked or not. Also, one thing I wanted to mention that I forgot to mention earlier is that in my examples here, this arrow that I had, if you're just looking at this on a white background, you wouldn't even notice this. But if you turn on your transparency grid, you can see that there's a little bit of white right here. Because when I created this, I'd accidentally left the default white fill. And you might have picked up on that when we were looking at the SVG code and wondering, hey, why in the arrow is there a white fill on something? And the reason I bring this up is because it's very easy to miss little things like this if you're not seeing the transparency grid, because it looks fine. But when you bring this into a web page, that white will actually display. So if you put this on a dark background or anything other than white, you're going to actually see that white. So make sure that you get rid of white unless you want that to be displayed in your SVG. And the best way to really see that is to show that transparency grid if you're wanting to really see how that looks. Okay, any other questions that I might have missed? You can copy and paste your question again if I missed it, or ask new ones in the chat. While I'm waiting for that, just a reminder that, like I said, any of the classes that we have, you can take them in person in New York City, or you can attend them live online as well. Basically, you would screen share into the instructor's computer while they're doing the class. So some of the people in class are going to be with us in New York City, and then some people attend online. And almost all of our classes are available as online, but whenever you click on one, it will say in New York City or live online. And if you take a class, the classes all come with a workbook. You can purchase the workbook separately, but if you take a course, you get the workbook as part of the class. And the books are available in print or in ebook format. So for example, if you want to get started right away, you can download the ebook and view it on any device. We give you a PDF that you could even print if you want, but we give you an EPUB file that you can load on any e-reader except for Kindle. For Kindle, we give you a Mobi file that you can load onto the Kindle. So we give you PDF, EPUB, and Mobi. You can load it onto any device that you want to using that. So we have a question in the chat. Can you please explain this, why SVG is sometimes described as insecure? I've been looking at plugins to allow it, but I'm hesitant. I'm assuming you're talking about WordPress plugins. I'm not familiar. Somebody else recently asked about security issues with SVG. I'm not familiar with security issues with SVG, so that's something that I'd have to investigate more myself. I haven't heard of specific ones, but yeah, it's somebody's typing in the chat, SVG is an element like any other SVG element. There's no code executed. It's interesting because somebody else in a live in-person seminar asked me the same thing. So I don't know what is going around. I don't know if there's truth to it, but I mean, I'm not sure. Let's see. So in the chat, you're saying, I was told by my theme developer that SVG was not allowed. I don't know that Yeah, I don't know that that's because it's a security problem with the theme. I mean, WordPress can do anything you want. If you want to use SVG in WordPress, you can. Now, certainly anything you're coding could do that. Whether or not the visual side of things always accept an SVG file, that might be another situation that you have to look into. But as far as I know, it's perfectly fine to use SVG. Now, SVG is a newer format. Not as many people are aware of its inner workings and how to use it properly. So I wouldn't be surprised if some developers are just shying away from it because they just haven't taken the time to dive into it and learn all the ins and outs of SVG. But it's very much worth learning because it's so flexible. So yeah, I'm not familiar with any particular code or code security issues with it, but suppose it's possible that there's just something that I'm not familiar with. Any other questions in here? Yeah, it's interesting that the developer would say that it's very insecure because it's just XML. I'm curious here. SVG security. Maybe it's SVG upload. Because, yeah, maybe it's just uploading. That might be it. Maybe it's not a matter of using SVG within the website, but uploading SVG. Because the other person that asked me the same question was regards to WordPress. So maybe in allowing SVG uploads, there might be a security issue. As far as using them on your website, there's not that I know of. But that could make sense to me, that there could be some upload security issue, and that would really be a WordPress thing. Yeah. Okay, well, I think I'm going to end the live stream recording here, but I'll hang out in the chat for those of you who are live here attending the chat, just in case you have any more questions. But just want to say thanks for coming, everybody. Hope you enjoyed. Please check out our workbooks and courses. If you like this video, click the thumbs up, like for the video down below the video. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, and hope to see you in a future live stream or maybe in a class. Thanks so much, and have a great weekend.